I had a couple conversations with people of like, oh, I really want to do something for Black History Month. Like, how do we go about this? We did Rebel's book last year, which was the history of Black craft in 10 objects, I think, which is an amazing book. And I love Rebel's work. And I wanted to piggyback off that as much as I could. Um, and this book just came across my research and totally floored me just from like the cover. I was so intrigued, and I just was like, we need to read this book." So I guess, um, so if you want to introduce yourself, but I really am intrigued on how this came to be as a book because it's so interesting.
Yeah, thank you. So hey everyone, I'm Zoe van Buren, and I live down here in Durham, North Carolina. I don't know if there's any other North Carolinians or Southerners on the call. Hey,
I'm in Durham, Chapel Hill.
hey, all right, very cool. um, so I am not originally from here. I grew up in New York City, and I came down to North Carolina for graduate school. They have a master's program at UNC Chapel Hill in folklore. It's one of the oldest um, folklore sort of graduate curriculums in the country. Um, and I came down very interested in, material culture and American sort of social issues and religion and music, but very sort of generalist to a fault in my interests. um, and wasn't really sort of sure what direction I was moving in. But after graduation, the first job that I was able to land was with an organization that's here in a smaller town that's just down the road from Durham called Hillsborough, North Carolina. And that organization was the Music Maker. Then it was called the Music Maker Relief Foundation. Now they just go by the Music Maker Foundation. And I started out as a program associate, I think was my title, and I was mostly doing like nuts and bolts of like logistics, getting artists on the road. The Music Maker Foundation has since early 90s has been primarily sort of serving the forgotten kind of pillars of American roots music who were excluded from, I think, their the due that they were owed based off of their cultural contributions because of poverty, because of uh, you know um, bad sort of business music business practices, health issues, age, and they would partner with artists who, you know, um, were really just kind of the heart and soul of American roots music. Maybe they had played with somebody very famous, maybe they never had, but they were kind of undiscovered or forgotten, and we're maybe having to make some really difficult decisions, like do I buy my diabetes medication this month, or do I pay my rent or put gas in my car? Um, and Music Maker's model was very unique, is very unique from other nonprofits that serve American culture, in that they not only did programming and concerts and tours and that kind of thing, but they also had sustenance grants for these artists. And so they would just pay to put a new roof over somebody's head or buy them their medication or um, show up at the Social Security office with a tray of cookies to try to like persuade the person on staff that day to actually handle the artist's case in a timely manner. They had all these stories about the lengths that they went to try to advocate for these musicians. Um, and along the way, they would often meet some really interesting craftspeople as well, people who sort of bridged the visual art and music world. And so I came in as a program associate, mostly just working on the sort of concerts, performance, touring side of it. I was booking flights and presenting shows and picking people up when their car burst into flames 15 minutes before a gig, and just being like just sort of there to do whatever the program manager needed done. Um, and along the way, working with Music Maker, they discovered that I enjoyed writing and was interested in doing more writing. And suddenly I started, being given more kind of writing based tasks, and my job kind of deepened and turned into a full-time gig. And Music Maker is founded and currently still run by a married couple, Tim and Denise Duffy. And Denise is really kind of the business brains of the operation, and Tim is the kind of artist brains and visionary force. And a lot of Music Maker's work was really kind of made possible by the fact that Tim also had a folklore training from the same program that I had gone through. And he was always out in the world finding new people and traveling all over the country. If he heard about somebody, he would go down to, New Orleans and or go to Georgia or go to Eastern North Carolina. And if he heard word that there was somebody um, who really might be somebody but wasn't yet somebody, he would go find them. And there was a gentleman out in Eastern North Carolina by the name of Lightning Wells, who's a Piedmont blues musician who also is just a very prolific record collector and kind of historian of uh, North Carolina music history, who in the business of living in Eastern North Carolina, which is a very, very rural agricultural part of our state, had come across a man named Freeman Vines in this very, very small town called Fountain. There's very little there. And Lightnin had struck up sort of a rapport with Freeman, and he called Tim Duffy one day and said, "There's a guy I want you to meet. He is really interesting. He's onto something. He's making guitars, and you've got to come see them." And so Tim, you know, jumped on the opportunity to meet an interesting person. And he drove down there with a mobile wet plate studio, photography studio, because that was Tim's sort of side craft that he was passionately developing his skills in, kind of separate from his music maker work, but it was intersecting. He was taking portraits of all the artists that they worked with in this old kind of tin type wet plate collodion technology, and had basically filled up a trailer with all of his gear and his giant camera and all the developer and everything inside of the studio, because you have to go straight from taking the photo to developing it right there. There's no taking it home and waiting. And so he shows up on Freeman's back porch with this mobile studio, and the guy who was my sort of supervisor at the time at Music Maker, Aaron Greenhead. And I think that was sort of that's a way of showing up in somebody's life that maybe you're hit or miss. You might be lucky if they're open to you. But I think that was actually why Freeman was open to Tim, was that he was intrigued by this, by Tim's own craft. He was a craftsperson. He saw somebody else who was very deep in obscure, an obscure technology, and that sort of piqued his interest. And he let them talk to him, and they talked for a while, and they took some photos eventually, and they just kind of kept going down and visiting. And there was a whole staff at Music Maker that would just sometimes go and visit. And this was all before I got there. And so by the time I got there, there was this little sort of audio archive of very loosely structured, interviews with Freeman. And a friend of mine who worked a lot with the vernacular sculptor Wallace Simpson. Also worth Googling if you're interested in kind of North Carolina folk art. Um, he told me his best interviews were the ones where you would fall asleep on the porch together and wake up and the audio recorder was still rolling, and then, like, maybe you'd keep talking and then you'd have to edit out the hour-long nap in the middle of it. And so, like, people were going, from Music Maker, we're just going down to see Freeman and visit and just sit on the porch and talk, and it was that kind of interviewing. It was um, very loose, very meandering, very just person to person. And and all the while, Tim was starting to take photos of Freeman's guitars. And so when I got there, there were sort of these two disjointed pieces of
Good.
the
How are
book.
you?
There were the photos of the guitars, then there were some that were more kind of just like
Okay.
straight, like catalog style portraits. And then there were the tintype images. And then there was hours and hours and hours of audio recording, completely like untranscribed, unarchived, like just raw. And at one point, I got the opportunity to join on a visit to see Freeman and went down there and got to meet him myself and did my own rambling, hour-long interview. Uh, and then we came back and, Tim had been trying to think about like what to do with these pictures of these guitars because they were very striking. Um, but he wasn't really
Okay.
sure what they were supposed to be. And so he was thinking,
Are you all right?
is this a catalog?
Okay.
Is this
You're fine.
um
Okay, hold on.
Dave,
Is
you're
this, like-
you're not
Okay.
muted.
oh yeah, I think we got somebody. So he was not sure sort of what the kind of point of all these pictures was going to be. And I was asked to kind of take a stab at ordering them into some kind of exhibit format. So telling some kind of visual story with the photos of the guitars and then some of the like more kind of atmospheric and landscape photos that Tim had also been taking around Eastern North Carolina and around Freeman's home. And uh, it was like, it was good, but something was really missing. And what was missing was like Freeman's voice. And, meanwhile, I was also transcribing all of these old audio recordings, mine and my colleagues, and stuff that had been done, before I got there and stuff that we were generating anew. And I really felt like the photos needed the voice and the voice needed the photos. And you would not really understand Freeman's artistry and his sort of the holistic nature of his of his of his mind, of his creative life without putting them together. Because in these interviews, he was telling all of this, heady stuff about like metaphysics and religion and then also Eastern North Carolina history and his memories from growing up very hard in a very, very culturally rich, but, materially very poor part of our state. And they were heavy stories. And, it was hard to kind of think about like how these two things were going to live together. But I really felt like there was kind of no point in putting the guitars out into the world if you weren't also listening to Freeman. And so that was kind of the seed of like, maybe this isn't just an exhibit, or maybe this isn't just a catalog, of numbered and named guitars. Maybe this is a book. And for the rest of my time working at Music Maker before I got the job that I currently have at the State Arts Council, that was my job. They basically just said, stop doing everything else. You're writing this book. And that was how the book came to be. And we had to shop it around some publishers. It was a very kind of independent process. It went through all these different versions and forms, but we actually sort of kept coming back to what I don't know what we had what made sense to us kind of internally. And there, we brought it in front of all these academics, and some of their help was helpful, some of their help was totally off in the wrong direction. And we always just kind of tried to bring it back to like Freeman and Tim and the story, and what they had done together, keeping it simple, keeping it very narrative, really sort of letting Tim and Freeman move the story along with like my essays in between, just there to kind of provide the scaffolding of the who, what, where, why, when. And and it just turned into a much more powerful project than I think any of us saw coming. And the whole story of the hanging tree guitars, like that was happening as we were doing this. When I was first going through those old interviews and trying to marry quotes with photos, the action of the sort of investigation of the story of Oliver Moore's lynching and the guitars that came out of the wood that was purportedly from a lynching tree, that had not happened yet. The wood was there. Freeman was sitting on it. He had been talking about, I'd been hearing about it in these interviews. We showed up at his house. He was like sanding it down by hand, taking like an inch and a half thick piece of wood and like hand planing it down to a fraction of an inch. But he didn't know what he was doing with it, and it was kind of heavy on his mind, and he was talking about it and questioning, like, what's the story? I wonder what happened. I wonder what happened to that man. And so it was while I was there and beginning to try to figure out what to do with this body of documentation about Freeman, that was when things really started to pick up. And in terms of Tim and Freeman sort of going on um, this journey to find the story, and visiting the site, and then all of the photos um, that Tim took of those of the hanging tree wood, like all those guitars were built during that time. And so the project was like constantly changing as we were building it, because the story kept changing. And then I was already in my next job. We thought we had this wrapped up. We had drafts with the publisher and everything, and all of a sudden Freeman mails Tim the final piece that he made with the wood of the shoe. And we were just like, okay, stop. We have another chapter to add. So this was like, everything was just very, we were just like trying to keep up with Freeman and where he was at. And then when it was all over, it was very spiritually depleting for him. And it was very exhausting to kind of live with that story for so long, and to go to such dark places with that wood. And he, after that shoe, that was kind of it. And he pivoted to just going back to looking for the sound and making more kind of conventionally bodied guitars again. And he made some beautiful work after that, but it was like he needed that break and that change. So anyway, that's a long sort of way to say how the book came to be.
No, that's perfect. It was really like when I read it, I felt like I was just listening to a conversation of some like old friends kind of going through a photo book together, like looking back, and it just made me like really relish their friendship, and like just kind of getting to sit and watch it kind of go from, yeah, somebody who just showed up with like this seemingly weird thing that they're both maybe unsure of each other, and then all of a sudden they're like really tight. I was like, this is the coolest story ever. Um, and then
Yeah, that was
knowing that the shoe came late is really like the shoe blew me away.
the shoe was unreal. Yeah, I mean, I'm not a suspicious person or a superstitious person, but that was one of those moments where you're just like, I can't explain this. Because Freeman said he didn't remember seeing anything about Oliver Moore being a cobbler at some point in his life. And but what you said about their friendship, I mean, that was there were a lot of considerations, that I was grappling with putting together a book like this because there were a lot of voices, and we were also trying to be very conscious of um, how this story might come across. It's like it touches into some territory where a lot of hurt's been done, when you think about the history of um, kind of vernacular African American craftspeople. I mean, musicians is like a whole other thing, but um, you know, being sort of discovered and then collected by white folk art collectors or high art collectors, however you might want to kind of draw your lines there. Um, like, right away, you're in some heavy history, and you're in a lot of complex dynamics. And Tim and Freeman were they were very self-awarely sort of navigating that racial line in their friendship, like especially once it got into the hanging tree guitar story, with Tim kind of going out and talking to the white side of town, and then Freeman talking to the black side of town, and then coming back and comparing notes, and knowing that neither of them would have ever been able to have that conversation or get that information out of people if the roles had been reversed. Um, but one of the things that I kind of imagined readers might wonder is like, what is Tim's influence on Freeman as an artist? We saw what he was doing before Tim enters the story. Tim enters the story, the work radically changes. And some of that was coming out of these conversations they were having. And some of that was stuff Tim was encouraging Freeman to do more of, like, oh man, that's cool. You should keep doing that. Um, and I think, I felt kind of aware that one way of telling this story might leave people feeling um, like Freeman was sort of doing one thing, and then this like art world guy kind of came in and pushed him onto a different course or something. Um, and it was just the only way to really kind of understand what happened was to describe the nature of their friendship and really put them in conversation, because at the exact same time, Tim's photography practice was completely pushed into a different vein by Freeman, and their kind of mutual curiosity about each other and respect for each other as masters of their craft was what kept the friendship strong. And then they were just constantly mutually influencing each other. Like, of course their work was different after they met. They were probably each other's biggest creative influence, going in both directions. Like, if you look at the work Tim was doing before he met Freeman, it does not look like what he does now or what he did with Freeman. Um, and so they were both radically altered by each other, and we wanted to just kind of like get out of this very sort of paternalistic um, way of thinking about sort of outsider artists, or folk artists, and as being kind of untouched or unsullied by like other influences, and to say no, actually, like, I mean, Freeman was one of the best read people I've ever met. He had traveled extensively. He'd explored many religious, you know, communities, and to try to paint him as this kind of outsider artist just sitting on his porch in Eastern North Carolina, unaffected by the world, would like really do a disservice to who he is. And so, of course, he had influences. He's an artist. Artists have influences, and similarly for Tim, like he was radically changed by their friendship. So we felt like both of their voices had to be there, and we had to try to capture some of that back and forth, some of that conversation, um, and keep the focus on Freeman, because we wanted this to stand as a way to understand sort of Freeman as an artist, beyond just the Hanging Tree Guitar story. But we knew Tim had to be there because it was like the action of the story was both of them together. So it was very difficult to navigate from like an editing and writing perspective. And it felt like there were a thousand ways to do it wrong. And um and it was a really, really challenging project. But at the end of the day, the guiding thing was like these are two artists, their mutual fascination with each other, their mutual trust in each other, is why this story unfolded. And so just to kind of keep going back to that and keep tapping into that was what kind of kept things grounded.
Yeah, I think it's very apparent. It comes through really well in the book. Uh, I had a bunch of other questions, but I gotta look in my notes. So you got to go out to his compound a bunch and kind of just like see him work. I was as like the woodworker in the reading the book, I was really concerned at like what his shop setup was like because there wasn't a ton of photos of him like working,
Chaos.
and I was really intrigued on what it was like. Like I definitely didn't envision like some like commercial shop planer joiner, but to hear you say that he was like sanding down in like increments of inches is crazy to us to think of, and shows the like process of an artist taking away everything that isn't what he sees, and it's really interesting.
Yeah, his shop setup I think would send most people like into a coma if they could if they saw how it was. Um it was, yeah, I mean he didn't own the house that he was living in. He didn't own the land that the house was on. Um it was a temporary housing situation. He had all of his guitars all around the property. I mean, Tim kind of talked about it like this just constant archaeology. Like every time he would go down there, they'd like move a piece of cardboard and be like, "Oh, here's seven more guitars." And he kept finding them, and Freeman was very like blasé about a lot of them because a lot of them he considered failures. They had not achieved the sound that he was seeking, and he didn't feel very materialistic about them. Like if they were not what he was going for, they were done. And there wasn't a lot of like sentimentality about his output. Um, Occasionally he'd make something for somebody if they asked, but that took a lot. And that that quest for the tone that he had once heard on the road, that's really what it was kind of all about until the Hanging Tree Guitars story came in. And so the his working space was um it was very like in the moment. He had the guitar he was working on right then, hoping it would be the one. He'd just sit on his porch, you know, putting in pickups, just sanding or hand carving. Everything was by hand. One of my favorite, quotes from him is talking about how there's no glory in machines, and that's why he does everything by hand. But it was also a meditative space for him to work like that. And I don't think he ever would have wanted a more efficient way of doing things because that would have robbed him of the flow state, the sort of transcendent experience of getting lost in his work and the way that that made him feel. And I'm also a artist and craftsperson myself, and like, I mean, that just like that really like hit home. Just this escaping any sort of way of valuing his work other than how it made him feel and whether or not it sounded right. And um, that was some of the stuff that really resonated with me very early meeting him. He had a kind of an enclosed shop as well. So there was the house, and then there was like a sort of a little shed. And there is a video somewhere online where you can see him kind of working in that space a little bit. But yeah, it was all hand tools, all, there's no machinery, nothing set up. It's just him sitting in a chair, with a guitar body in his lap. Um, and so it was very portable. Like he kind of tuck stuff away and then come get it later. Um, and when after the book, one of the things that developed after the story here is that Music Maker had developed all of these new connections in Eastern North Carolina and met a lot of other artists and had really sort of gotten to know the town of Fountain and Pitt County in general, and they had made such a like interesting network of connections there that they ended up buying 3 storefronts in downtown Fountain, which were sitting empty. And they converted one of them into a photo studio, one of them into a recording studio, and then the third space was Freeman's studio. And so he basically lived in that studio in his final years. And they had some people who would come and take him to his doctor's appointments, and they brought him meals, um, and he just had this whole like open space to himself to continue working. And that space maybe looked a lot more kind of recognizable as an artist studio, but the way he was when Tim encountered him was the his home and the property that the home was on, like it was kind of Tim thought it was kind of like a museum, like it was like an art environment almost. And there is there's a long history, almost sort of a tradition of creative expression in kind of Black Southern rural life, of arranging things in, on your lawn or sort of in the woods, and creating these art environments out of sometimes garbage or cast off or found objects. And to the sort of casual viewer, a lot of it might look like just a mess or just sort of an assemblage of stuff, but it's actually like very intentional and very meaningful. And so Tim kind of had that feeling when he showed up at Freeman's house and saw the way that the guitars were stacked and tucked away everywhere, and um, that it might look like a mess, but it was a fully functioning work environment for Freeman. And he was in a place where like at any minute you could turn over something and find the find the next most amazing guitar that he had made. And he'd take it out and Freeman would be like, oh, that old thing. um, and people would often come and try to steal the guitars, especially as like word kind of got around that he was getting photographed and visited more. And so he got very anxious about theft and asked Tim to put a lot of them in his studio in Hillsborough. But he never wanted to sell them individually or like put them on the market as art pieces or anything like that. So the whole collection still stands, and most of it is back in Fountain, in Freeman's studio, or like on the walls of the recording studio. And you can visit it and see all of these incredible guitars in one place, and it's very stunning.
Yeah, we have a little chat that's like, or maybe I put it in here, but we do like favorite quotes, and that one of Freeman's, I prefer to do it by hand for one simple reason. It takes all the glory out of what you're doing when you use a lot of modern tools. It's just like said it so perfectly. I couldn't even, because my background is from like a very, you know, mechanized shops where I'm not involving myself that much in the process other than turning on or off the machines,
Right.
and trying to change my outlook onto like the artistry is in the hand working from here to here, not like the machine doing the thing. So I'm actively
Right.
trying to change my brain to work that way. And also it's like the intentional, in like how he kind of gallerized his space is something that I find like a lot of like very just prolific artists who have that like just urge to create with no structure and no finish line to do. It's
Mhm.
like so incredibly impressive to me that they just can create prolifically and lay it out and observe it themselves and be just satisfied with themselves. It's like I long for that so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this book made me really long for that. Just like I just want to be happy sitting on my porch and carving away at something and just
Yeah.
find satisfaction in just the simplest things.
Yeah, one of my favorite quotes is like right around that one about the glory, where he says material things don't mean a lot to him. And I remember hearing him say that and being kind of surprised because like there's no way you make hundreds of, of handmade guitars and then say material things don't mean anything to you. I just that was incongruous to me, but it actually made a lot of sense because he was, other than the search for the sound, like the practice for him was about the way it made him feel. It was about that sort of mind body wood connection, and that was something he really needed. He needed that sense of purpose, that sense of peace. He needed that place that he could go to, and he spoke beautifully about kind of where his mind went when he was working. And if he had a more efficient sort of productive process, it would have like he wouldn't have had the opportunity or the space um, to experience what he did get to experience internally because of the way he worked. And then he also got to know the wood in this extremely unique way because he is there taking literally every fraction of an inch of of wood fiber down by hand. He's seeing every like layer of the wood as he's working through it in a way where if you just sort of run it through a planer, you don't know what you just cut through. And so he had this really deep relationship to the sort of qualities of the wood and including what had happened to it before it came to him. So, cracks or oils or um, warping or like, the life that it had lived before was very tangible to him and really made a difference in his view when it came to the final sound that he was going to get. And also, just in terms of it being something he felt proud of, he would always sort of say, like, if you've got a Gibson, you've got a conventional guitar. He had no interest in like the finest luthiery. He had no interest. You could buy him a $20,000 guitar and he would probably have minimal interest in it um, because there was no relationship to the wood itself. There was no like, it was like, so what? Where did this wood come from? He has no idea. There's no story. There's no sense of what it's been through that, would give him a relationship to the object. And yeah, he has this one great quote in there about like, a man who has my guitars, like has I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said like he wants to know it's really his. He wants, that's why he doesn't paint them. He leaves the wood raw. He wants to really have a relationship with this object. Um, and yeah, he understood that as something that like the final recipient of the guitar would want, that he would want as the maker. And if he sped up that process in any way, I think it would kind of ruin it.
Mule slobber was my favorite of the
Yeah.
ingredients of
Yes,
his.
the froth. Yeah. And the step from the tobacco barn and the piano backboard. I mean, there's all these sort of there's pieces of the landscape and of everyday life, and he had this relationship to it before the wood from the lynching tree came into the picture, and so that was why it sort of hit him so heavily when that wood did come into his life because he was already so attuned to um, what the history of his materials meant to him throughout the guitar making process.
Yeah, last month we did a book, and it like briefly touched on like Shintoism and a lot of like energy disbursement and all these things that have to do with like the universe and nature and all these. And it seems like he talks a bit about God and he talks a bit about like how he doesn't really know where he stands with it. And he very much seems to be leaning towards that like Japanese belief. It's like almost written down perfectly. I wonder if he just had that feeling or if he was taught that in his travels. Like I'm so intrigued on his insight into that a little bit.
Yeah, I wonder. He definitely was kind of a spiritual um, traveler and had kind of dabbled in um, some pagan communities, and his sisters are all are and were, some of them have passed, an amazing gospel group called the Glorifying Vine Sisters. So he came out of that sort of hitting the road gospel circuit kind of culture where you would work all week and then a whole family pile into the van on Friday night and show up at some, gospel anniversary gig up in like New Jersey and do a show for like 45 minutes for $100 and then drive back home and go back to work on Monday. Like that. I mean, that's the life his family lived. His sisters lived that. They still live it. His sister Alice is a really dear friend, and she's just like, they're road warriors, um, and had a lot of like influences you might not expect, a lot of like country music as well. Um, and then he had stints in prison and was down in Louisiana for a while, and just he would just sort of reference all of this kind of religious text and philosophical text that we had almost never heard of or had barely heard of, and it all went a lot deeper than I really sort of knew what to do with in the book. But yeah, I do feel like if he had ever gotten the opportunity to like go to Japan or something, he would have done something amazing with that. But he was one of those people where from the outside you would think, I don't even know that he ever had like a social security number. He was so off the grid. Um, and so like put on the margins. But just continually surprised us with like how educated he was, how well read he was, how far he had kind of explored in his life. Somebody who, if you just sort of saw him at the store, you would think had like never left his hometown. Um, but he lived a very complicated and deep life and had his toes in a lot of different cultures and ideas.
I love his take on it seems very apropos now is the quote, anything a worm don't eat, it ain't good for you. And I'm like, that rural North Carolina, like growing, I'm from New York also, so it's like very not you go to the grocery store and you get kind of what you get. And
Right.
um, it's so fun to hear somebody like living on land, having a take on something. And it's like, normally you hear farmers pushing pesticides, or that's the narrative that we're kind of shown, and it's nice to see. I just love that. Anything worm don't eat, it ain't good for you.
Yeah,
Yeah,
every once in a while, they just drop these like gems of ecological wisdom, and you're like,
yeah,
"Yeah, man." um, but I think one thing that's kind of good to visualize is there's some pictures in the book facing where he lived, and then there's some pictures of tobacco fields, and those tobacco field pictures are the view from his porch. So
yeah. I
that's what
love
he
it.
was looking out at as he was sitting on his porch working on his guitars. And and I told him I was from New York, and he would kind of make fun of me for all the stuff I hadn't tried, and like food and bathtub wine and that kind of thing. And and he, I think because like I was talking about coming from a city, like that drew out him talking about how important it was to just like live in a place where you can see the stars and live in a place where you can kind of feel the earth turn. And he watched that tobacco field sort of go through its cycle throughout the year, saw everything, that happened to the crop, anything they put on it, anything the workers did, the way it was harvested, the way it was planted, the way it was, sprayed. And so he was very aware, just every day, literally just watching like an agricultural site day in and day out. And then also like that's his family background. His parents were, were sharecropping, and both mom and dad worked farm work most of the time, um, and that was, that was a lot of people's life, and so he was very intimately aware of the land, and then had enough kind of underground knowledge to also be asking all these questions about the history of the land, and all those questions that he would ask about like where are the graveyards, where are the bodies, what happened, where did they put the people. He kind of he had this like lens on Eastern North Carolina that was always like one or two generations deeper than what most people remembered or knew how to look at it with.
That's one thing that I was thinking a lot when I was reading this, like how much that area of North Carolina has changed in a lot of ways, and it wasn't that long ago that it was very, very different. Um, I moved down to North Carolina when I was 12 from New York, like I guess
Mhm. I guess
lots
we
of
all
people here. um, but we moved to Eastern North Carolina. I remember just driving through all these tobacco fields
yeah,
and being like, "What is this?" Uh, it being a different world, and so much of that is, some of it's still there, but a lot is just gone now. Like it is not
right.
the same
Yeah,
as,
tobacco's dead.
you
Yeah,
know,
the fact that he was looking at tobacco field
and
is like rare now. Yeah.
no, so it's
Yeah, I think something that like is
wild.
kind of uh one image just to put in your head to kind of like imagine what Eastern North Carolina is like now is one of the biggest um agricultural practice there is hog farming, and all of the pork that is raised and all of the soy that goes to feed the pork that's raised by Smithfield and shipped all around the country and to China, um, is all sort of that's all happening in Eastern North Carolina. And what they do is they create these ponds filled with water that all of the manure from the hogs is basically flows into, and it creates liquid fertilizer. And then they just spray the liquid fertilizer on the crops that create the feed for the hogs. And so you'll be driving down like I-40, maybe you're going to the beach or something, and suddenly this like rancid poop smell will just permeate your car. And that's because they're spraying. And there are communities that just have to live under this poop rain. And it causes spikes in cancer rates. It causes all kinds of health problems. There's been some like investigative documentary work done about hog farming practices in Eastern North Carolina, but it is like the dominant industry, and you kind of can't fight them. And so there's a lot of people who are, too poor, too marginalized, too Eastern North Carolinian to be better taken care of, where they live. And it's a hard place. It's a place that floods a lot. They get a lot of uh, the effect of hurricanes and climate change actually has a worse effect there than on the coast. Like on the coast, the hurricanes come and they batter the houses and then it's gone, right? Like the storm is over and the water goes out to the ocean. But all of that water rushes up like the river basins into Eastern North Carolina, which is all just flat coastal plain. And it causes flooding that will sit there for like a week and destroy people's homes. And um, and so somebody like Freeman living in, in Fountain is really in the crosshairs of a lot of the ecological destruction, um, both natural and man-made in our state. And he knew that. He knew it really well.
One of the things that really stood out to me was just how much this book captures sort of the experience you spoke about. Like it was a book that unfolded as people were working on the project and discovering new information. But I feel like these images and the story and the words, and it's not just one person's words, it's your words and Tim's words, and I think it all just creates this atmosphere. And I don't think a lot of books have an atmosphere, but this one really seems to capture that emotion. Anyways, I don't have any question there. It's just this book was really profound. There was something that Tim said in it that kind of stood out to me. The journey has had a profound impact on me, all of which I have yet to understand. So it was like, I feel like that sentence alone kind of captures some of the tone of the different layers of stories in the book. I mean, there's the really heavy core stories, but it's also these moments of, sitting on your back porch, looking at this beautiful field and making something beautiful. And I think it captures the heavy stuff, and I think it captures the beauty of it as well, and the lighter moments and those moments that carry all of us through the darker stuff, I think.
Thank you. I'm really glad that that's what you got from it, because that was exactly what I was hoping would come through. Is Freeman had been making guitars for 40 years before Tim met him, and we didn't want to completely overshadow the rest of his work and the rest of his life and artistic experience with the intensity of the hanging tree story. We knew it was a powerful kind of narrative device and a powerful hook and a real sort of then this happened kind of story, and that was going to kind of drive the arc of the book. But the whole time I was really concerned, are we reducing Freeman to this one chapter of his life? This is his blue period. And you can't just talk about an artist's work based off of one time in their life. And he never did that before, and he didn't do it again. And it wasn't, we had to tell that story, but it wasn't right to leave it with just that. And so it was really important to also bring in all of these other aspects of Freeman's experience, but also his sense of humor and his happiness and his agency and his love for the land, and to not have him just be this kind of victim of Southern history, but also really kind of owning his relationship to this place he really loved. He would never want to live anywhere else. That was his land. And so I felt very sort of conscious while we were telling that story that it would be really easy to flatten Freeman out, and sort of at all costs, I wanted to try to avoid that. So thank you for sharing that. That's how it came across to you.
I also love the photography of the offcuts. There's something there's something magical about those images as well. I think
Tim was very
it's like the guitars tell the story, but even the pieces that were removed from the tree, not even just the story of the hanging tree, but all of these offcuts that are part of the story, even though they're not part of the final object. I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah, because all his guitars
I don't have much else to say. The book, I mean, it's just, you kind of have to absorb it. You have to absorb the photography and the words. And some of us were talking in the Discord, how had to read certain sections over and over and over because something really, caught us or captured a moment or an emotion or a feel or something. And there's it's on every page in the book, which was what was so astonishing, every image. So anyways, I just want to say it's thanks for your contribution.
Thank you.
It's great.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. I really enjoyed the like humility of the book and the honesty that was like a common thread through that. Like Freeman is fine being Freeman in every capacity and like the different stages of his life and creation, and how humble he was about it. Just a simple sound was enough for him to be connected to a material, and then how each of the guitars stayed the same way. And I just thought it was really symbolic continuously, like his perspective on the material, his approach to the material, like the things he wanted to say in and out from his work before the hanging tree work and the work during and the work after, that like each thing had its own singular message. And I just found that to be so fascinating. And that's what I kept reading a page again and again, because although the statement might have been something that was seemingly simple, it just felt like it had so much more depth. And then the photos also seemed to capture that too. Like it was just so much depth in the very like small threads of life. And it was just, I really enjoyed that being the presence of the book. And like you guys were saying before, like the atmosphere of it, I felt like it translated out through. So this has been a favorite read of mine for quite a while.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I can't tell you like what a massive sigh of relief I breathed when the draft was done and Freeman read it over before publication, um and he said, "Oh, you didn't." And I was like, I felt like I was taking a lot of artistic liberties with the layout, with the formatting, with the way I was sort of representing the transcriptions from the interviews. I felt like I was really walking a tightrope there of, accurately representing what it feels like and sounds like to sit in Freeman's presence, but also, knowing that just kind of straight transcription was not going to cut it. But also realizing that in order to try to accurately convey him, I had to heavily manipulate the layout of the words. So I was very concerned about how he was going to feel once it was presented to him with that layout. And he said, "Oh, you didn't mess with my words at all. It sounded just like me." And I just went, "Oh, thank God. We can publish this book now."
Yeah, that seems like a lot of pressure trying to like find that channel and voice and making sure it's represented like accurately and then presenting it to that artist. Yeah, that seems pretty intense actually. I hadn't really considered that. So that's a
lot of
lot.
work went into trying to capture that kind of like that humility and that straightforwardness, and that, a lot of editing happened to sort of pare things down to like not projecting too much, not being too sort of prescriptive about how the reader is supposed to interpret, Freeman's work. My writing style was always like, take out less, fewer adjectives, fewer, don't start going off into some sort of like, this represents that, because like, I don't know, Freeman was not super descriptive about his work. He never would say like, "Oh, this like face means this, and I did this symbol because it comes from this." Like, you had to really, really listen carefully to pick up the kind of thread of what some of that symbolism meant. And I just felt like it would be wrong to kind of go in there and try to do this whole thesis about his work. And at the end of the day, it had to just be seen. You had to, you are looking at it through Tim's literal lens. And therefore, that's why the story had to be about both of them, because we're not just looking at Freeman, we are looking at Freeman through Tim. But to just sort of strip away the impulse to try to explain, and let the work do its own talking, and then let Freeman and Tim's voices do their own talking, and let the kind of action of what happened stand for itself and explain itself, and not be really telling people how to feel too much about it, because I just had this feeling. I mean, we were writing this in like, it was almost 10 years ago now. But I just had this awareness in the moment that it would be really tempting to write in a way that would feel sort of like correct for that moment in time. But we also knew this might be the one big thing that ever gets written about Freeman. And if that's the case, we don't want it to feel like dated or like it sort of screamed 2018 or it had to be kind of stripped back. It had to be kind of simple and humble, and so that as time progressed, people could kind of re-encounter Freeman's words and the pictures, and let that kind of impact maybe shift with time and have, maybe it'll feel really different. Maybe it'll come across really different in 20 years or something. And maybe that'll be for better or for worse. But it felt like the only way to kind of just take an honest stab at something that would be kind of timeless is to, even though it was like I had to do a lot of intervention in the editing and the layout and the, the organization of the book, to also just sort of let them be themselves and have them take it from there.
Yeah, I think you did a very great job of making it a timeless, just great read. As we are coming up on we usually do an hour plus a little bit, but I don't want to keep anybody too long. But Zoe, I did want to talk about your work in the paper cutting, because I came across that on your Instagram when I was looking you up. Not a medium I knew much about. It is very interesting. If nobody else has looked, check out Zoe's Instagram, because it's something I really want to now try my hand at, just because you've done such a cool job of displaying this new thing. If you want to talk a little bit about that, I'd love to hear about it.
Sure. Yeah, I'm sort of a fly-by-night, paper cut artist. It's gotten some traction in recent years that I wasn't expecting, and now I feel like, oh, okay, oh no, I need to really, I need to lock in on this and do more. But yeah, it was something that emerged out of COVID. I've always been more of like a fiber arts kind of person. I've always made very practical things, only making things that you can like wear or use, and had never really felt like I was sort of just that interested in making kind of visual art or decorative art. And something about paper cutting just kind of, I don't know, it gave me a way to sort of break out of those limitations that I had put on myself. I started it during the pandemic because it was what I had in the house and didn't have to go to the store to buy supplies for. And my work is, I'm the folk and traditional arts director, or folk life director is my actual title, at the North Carolina Arts Council. And so everything that I do, everything that I've kind of spent my brain power on and my interest in, is very kind of traditional, culturally rooted arts. And even though there are many traditional paper cutting practices and cultures all over the world, which are all stunning and beautiful and you should explore them, I felt like I was doing this like totally disconnected from any of that. I was not trying to like reconnect with my German roots or something by doing paper cutting. So it was like the first time I allowed myself like an art practice that was just me. But I love the limitations of it. I love that you only have two colors unless you go in and start, kind of breaking outside of the fundamentals. And I love that you have some non-negotiable rules, like that every piece needs to connect to another piece or else it structurally won't hold up. And so it just like, it takes away the sort of terror of the blank page creatively, because you've got some pretty like physical, real world like limitations to work within, and that is something that helps me try to be a little bit more creative. And so I mostly started working off of like pictures that I had taken kind of throughout my work as a folklorist. So a lot of artists and people that I had met, or scenes from, work and play and music, and just trying to find like a different way to relate to my kind of more ethnographic fieldwork output, and take pictures that didn't mean that much. They felt kind of like a dime a dozen in a photographic form, but then to interpret them in a paper cutting form, it felt like just giving a lot of value and weight to these like little quiet moments that might have just been sitting on my camera roll or something. And so it's been a really fun, a fun thing that I do on the side. If anybody listens to the band Watch House, who were formerly Mandolin Orange, their latest record, the album cover is one of my paper cuts, which was a sort of crazy coincidence that happened last year. So it's something I want to do more of, and take more seriously, but it's also really nice to just like let myself have a craft practice that comes and goes, and it's not my bread and butter. I don't make a living off of it, but that's kind of liberating too.
Exactly. Yeah, I've been kind of dabbling in marquetry a lot lately. I think it's become a more popular like woodworking field. And it's very similar. Like you can knife cut it or you can saw cut it. And I was like, oh, this is cool, like experimenting in just the two tones. I thought it was very interesting how much you can convey in two colors.
Yeah. It just forces you to try to think a little bit differently about like light and negative space, positive space. You talked about the off cuttings of Freeman's guitars. Like it's that same kind of thought of like what is left when I remove this. And I like that limitation.
Real quick, I want to talk about next month's book because it's now March. We're doing Deirdre Visser's book, The Joinery, Joists, and Gender for National Women's Month. Really cool book.